Grandma's house stood on the edge of a small town in the heart of Iowa. It was old, with a faded facade and a rickety porch that creaked even with a gentle breeze. After her death, the house was empty, and with it the once warm spirit of family comfort. Emma, a young student, came here to sort through her grandmother's belongings. This task seemed endless. Old albums, boxes of newspapers, magazines, postcards. Every little thing reminded her of how happy her childhood had been. But it was among these memories that she hid a secret that she was destined to escape. Deep in one of the old boxes that smelled of dust and old paper, Emma found something unusual, a photograph. It was her grandmother, young and smiling, wearing a bright floral dress. She was standing at the entrance to the carnival, which appeared to be located in the middle of a field. In the background were large striped tents, rows of light bulbs that sparkled even in the picture, and old signs promising unforgettable spectacles. But Emma's gaze did not stop there. To the left, in the shadow of a large circus tent, stood a dark figure. At first glance, it could have been a simple blur or a defect in the old film, but the longer she looked, the more convinced she became that it was a person. A black, blurry figure without a face was looking directly into the camera lens. On the back of the photo was a short note: "Do not go beyond the light." Emma frowned. She had heard stories from her grandmother about a strange carnival that once stood outside the city. They were only snippets, references to unusual performers, to events that made people run away, but no one ever explained the details. The locals said that the carnival had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and the forest where it had been located had since become an empty and eerie place. Emma looked up from the photo. Her grandmother's words came to mind: "Stay away from the forest. Nothing good happens there." But now, looking at this picture, she felt something new, an overwhelming curiosity. What was hiding in this place? Why did her grandmother leave this photo? It was a gloomy day, with heavy clouds in the sky, when Emma set out for the local library. She needed to learn more. She realized that the story of the carnival was not just a legend. She was sure that something real was behind the rumors. Among the archives in the library, she found several yellowed newspaper articles that mentioned the carnival. The Great Dream Show, as it was called, appeared in the town in the summer of 1971. It attracted hundreds of people from neighboring towns, but it lasted only a few weeks. After that, according to one of the articles, the carnival simply disappeared, as if it had vanished into thin air. In a newspaper from August of that year, there was a short note about the disappearance of several people who were last seen on the carnival grounds. The police investigated, but no traces were found. The last line of the article sounded gloomy. "The carnival is gone, but the forest still remembers." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She put the articles on the table and looked at them thoughtfully. Something told her that her grandmother knew more about this forest than she was telling. The next morning, Emma went to the place mentioned in the articles. The forest was dense and gloomy. The wind hardly penetrated, and the trees seemed to cover the sky. The path that led to the heart of the forest was almost overgrown, but at its end Emma saw something strange. In the middle of the forest were the remains of an old carnival. Broken carousels, weathered signs, and striped cloths that had once been part of the tents now looked decayed by time. But there was something else. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if it had a rich metal smell. Emma stopped. Her attention was drawn to a building that had miraculously survived, a mirror maze. The glass panels were partially broken, but some remained intact. Emma came closer and saw her reflection. For a second, it seemed alien to her. Her heart sank with anticipation. But this was only the beginning. Emma stood in front of the mirror maze, trying to suppress a growing sense of anxiety. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and the forest was beginning to sink into ghostly twilight. The mirror panels reflected the last of the light, creating bizarre reflections on the decaying trees. It seemed that this place was living, breathing, and waiting for something. Her reflection in the remnants of the glass looked ordinary, but something else was visible in the depths of the mirrors. It was as if someone was standing behind her, lingering out of sight. She blinked, and the figure disappeared. Emma walked closer to the maze. The sign above the entrance was barely legible, but the word miracles could still be seen among the rusty letters. Her mind fought against the urge to leave, but her feet led her forward. The first step inside seemed like a threshold to another world. Inside the labyrinth, there was a strange silence. Only a faint buzzing, like an electric charge, filled the space. The mirrors reflected her face from all sides, but with each step she began to notice that some of the images were not quite synchronized with her movements. One of the reflections paused for a moment when she turned her head, as if her double hadn't had time to repeat the gesture. Emma tried to calm herself down. It's just a play of light, she thought. But the air was getting heavier, and it felt like someone was following her. Her heart pounded as she saw a dark figure ahead of her, quickly darting between the mirrors. Her steps froze. "Is someone here?" she asked, but the voice faded into the endless corridors. Emma tried to find a way out, but the mirrors refused to cooperate. The corridors changed, as if the place had a life of its own. She stopped in front of a panel that looked particularly clean. In it, the reflection seemed alien. Its eyes looked at her, but the look was cold, almost empty. She leaned closer and suddenly heard a whisper. "You came? Welcome." Recoiling, Emma turned back, but the way she had come had disappeared. A corridor of mirrors led her to a new space. In the center of this room stood an old carousel. Its light bulbs glowed dimly, creating a warm but false sense of comfort. Figures sat on the carousel, frozen in awkward poses. Their faces were too realistic, as if they were not dolls but people trapped in a trap. Emma froze. Her gaze lingered on one of the figures, a young woman who looked very much like her grandmother when she was younger. She looked like she was trying to say something, but her lips were not moving. As Emma got closer, she noticed a sign near the carousel. It was old, cracked, but still readable. It read, "Here all your dreams come true, but only those you are willing to pay for." The lights on the carousel began to flicker, and the space around it darkened. Silence gave way to distant footsteps. They came from behind her, slowly at first, then faster, as if someone was chasing her. Emma turned around, but saw no one. Panic gripped her. She started running, looking for a way out. Her reflections in the mirrors became more and more distorted. Her arms looked too long. Her face looked ominously smiling. One of the mirrors showed her something completely unbelievable. Her reflection stood still, even as she ran. Then it turned its head and slowly nodded to her, as if to say, "You are here forever." Running out of the maze, Emma found herself in front of the same entrance, but now it looked completely different. A new sign glowed above the door. "The show is just beginning." A moment later, the lights went out. Emma realized that the forest, the carnival, and the mirrors were behind her, but they hadn't let her go forever. She kept hearing those words in her head. The show is just beginning. Emma ran out of the maze and fell to her knees in front of the entrance, trying to control her panic. Her heart was beating as if it was about to burst out of her chest. The woods around her seemed denser and darker than before, and even the cold night air could not dispel the feeling that she was being watched. She turned back. The mirror maze was still there, as if nothing had happened, but the reflections on its surfaces seemed predatory. Above the entrance, where there had been a barely visible sign, a new inscription now shone. "This is where the path ends an eternity begins. Emma did not understand what was happening. She breathed deeply, trying to calm down. But suddenly a sound from behind her made her freeze. A barely audible rustle, as if someone was sliding across the leaves. She turned around cautiously, but saw nothing. The darkness seemed to tremble, shimmering in the air. The feeling of cold and danger became almost tangible, as if it were something alive. And then she heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, they were approaching. Emma stood up and started to back away, holding the flashlight in front of her. She thought she saw movement between the trees, but when she tried to focus on it, the movement disappeared. The footsteps came from all directions, combining into a strange rhythm, like a drumbeat. They seemed to encourage her to move further into the forest. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Stay close to the light." But there was only darkness around her, and no hint of where she could find salvation. Suddenly, something new appeared ahead. A huge circus tent loomed among the dense trees. Its striped canvases looked strangely bright, as if they were not subject to the decay of time. 2 lanterns stood at the entrance, illuminating the road with a warm, almost soothing light. But there was something false about this calmness. The entrance to the tent was decorated with an arch with an inscription, "The Great Dream Show." The same word she had seen in an old photograph. She felt a coldness in her stomach. Her grandmother was here. She knew this place. Emma took a few steps forward, and as soon as she was under the lights, the footsteps behind her stopped. But this did not bring relief. On the contrary, the tension grew even stronger, as if the forest was holding its breath. She looked at the entrance to the tent. Her hand trembled as she pulled back the canvas to enter. The atmosphere changed as soon as she crossed the threshold. It was surprisingly warm inside, but this comfort seemed unnatural. The air was saturated with the smell of cotton candy, sugar, and metal. The arena in the center had old rides, a carousel, Ferris wheels, even a small stage for performances. But everything was frozen. No sound, no movement. The rides looked as if they had been stopped at the peak of their action, leaving the figures sitting on them in bizarre poses. Emma approached the stage. She felt the air getting thicker and a sense of heaviness on her shoulder, as if something invisible was pressing down on her. On the stage stood a figure dressed as a circus entertainer. He was motionless, like a mannequin, but his eyes were alive. They were directed directly at Emma. He raised his hand and pointed to the carousel in the center of the arena. The lights on it flickered, and it began to rotate slowly. The figures on the carousel's horses, which had previously seemed frozen, began to move as if they were coming to life. Their faces became more human, and their eyes followed Emma more closely. Emma felt her legs begin to move on their own, leading her toward the carousel. Her mind screamed that this was a trap, but her body would not obey. She stepped onto the carousel platform, and the world around her began to change. The forest disappeared. The mirror maze disappeared. She found herself in a dark space where there was only the rotation of the carousel and many eyes looking at her from all sides. Voices began to sound from everywhere. "You are ours. The show is just beginning." The last thing she saw was her own reflection in one of the carousel mirrors. But it was no longer her. The face was smiling in a way she could never smile. The carousel stopped. The forest reappeared, and the darkness dissipated. But Emma was gone. Only the new figure on the carousel remained in the arena, her face frozen in a monstrous smile. And above the tent, in the moonlight, a new sign glowed. "Welcome! Our new star is waiting for you." The forest was again filled with a silence that seemed unnatural. A new sign shone above the circus tent, its letters shimmering, emitting a bizarre light. The huge carousel froze, stopping in mid-spin, and a new figure on it was motionless, but all too realistic. Emma was no longer a part of the world she knew, but her presence was still in the air. At this time, somewhere outside the forest in a small town, a few locals noticed that something had changed. They had always avoided this forest, not even admitting to themselves why. But that night, the feeling of fear became stronger. One of the old-timers, a local historian named Henry, decided to act. He remembered the horrific events of 1971, when the Great Dream Show Carnival disappeared with several people. Back then, the police found no evidence, and the rest of the residents simply hushed up the events, as if they were afraid to even mention them. But Henry always felt that the carnival hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. There was no peace in Emma's house either. On the table where she had left the photo of the carnival, there was now a new object, a chain with a pendant in the shape of a small mirror. It had appeared out of nowhere, but it was as old as the photo. Her neighbor Linda, who was checking the house after the girl disappeared, saw the mirror and picked it up. Immediately, she felt as if she was not alone. Linda noticed that the mirror did not show her reflection, but another girl, young, with wide eyes and hair in braids. She looked scared, and although Linda didn't know Emma very well, she was sure it was her face. Meanwhile, Henry gathered some locals in the library. He opened up old maps in front of them that showed the location of the carnival. Old newspapers and magazines confirmed his hunch. This place was not just forgotten, but closed off from the world by some otherworldly force. This carnival feeds on people's fears and dreams, he said, looking at the audience. Anyone who approaches it risks leaving something of themselves in there. One of the young men, named Mike, asked if there was a way to save those already trapped. Henry hesitated, but admitted it. There are old legends that say the heart of the carnival can be destroyed if you find the source of its power. But this place is defended, and it won't let go of its prey so easily. At this time, Emma, if she could still be called Emma, was in a world between mirrors. She no longer felt her body, but her consciousness remained active. She could see the carousel, see people who had visited the carnival in the past, and feel their dreams turning into nightmares. Her new form was part of this place, but her spirit had not yet surrendered. She began to hear voices. Among them were the whispers of other souls who had come here before. They begged her for help, repeating the same thing: find a fire in your heart. She didn't understand what this meant, but she felt her thoughts begin to concentrate. If she could change anything, it was now. Back in the real world, Henry, Linda, and Mike headed into the woods. They weren't sure what they would find there, but something told them they couldn't wait. As they approached the place where the carnival was supposed to be, they were greeted by silence, as unnatural as ever. The tent appeared before them suddenly, as if it had grown out of the fog. The lanterns at the entrance were on again, and the sign above the entrance had changed. Welcome, the show is on. They knew that from that moment on, there was no turning back. Henry whispered, stay together. This place feeds on our fear. And they entered the tent. Inside, the carnival came to life. Lights flashed, rides spun, but there were no people around. Only moving shadows sliding between the lights. There was a carousel in the center of the stage, and Mike recognized Emma among the other figures. Her eyes seemed empty, but there was still a spark of life in them. They knew time was running out. But how to stop this place? The answer could only be in the heart of the carnival, but it was still hidden. Henry, Linda, and Mike stood in the center of the arena. The carousel on which Emma was standing among the frozen figures was spinning slowly, illuminated by flashing lights. Her face was frozen, but there was still a glimmer of consciousness in her eyes. There was an air of anxiety in the air, and shadows danced around the stage, whispering words that could not be understood. It's a trap, Henry said, looking around carefully. This carnival is feeding on our fear and trying to divide us. We have to stay together. But the carnival had already begun. The lights around the arena came on and off, creating bizarre, moving shapes in the darkness. The shadow next to Mike began to form into something more definite. The figure of a man who grabbed him by the shoulder and forced him to turn around. His face turned pale as he saw his little sister, who had long since disappeared. "Mike," the shadow whispered. He took a step to the side, reaching for her, and immediately disappeared into the darkness. "Mike," cried Linda, but Henry grabbed her arm. "Don't look. It's not her. Don't let them lure you in." Meanwhile, Emma, though still part of the merry-go-round, was beginning to feel her awareness return. Her thoughts became clearer. The whispers of the souls around her became clear. Find the heart of the carnival. Destroy it while you still can. She felt her body obeying her. Her hands, which had been frozen before, were able to move. She reached for the base of the carousel, where the light source seemed to be coming out. Henry and Linda approached the carousel. They saw Emma's figure start to move, but they also saw the shadows grow more aggressive. Their whispers turned into shouts, and the faces around them were distorted with anger. "We have to help her," Henry said, but the road to the carousel was blocked. The shadows began to form into something more. They wove together, creating a huge figure that blocked access to the arena. "The show cannot stop," the creature growled. Its eyes glowed with the same ominous light as the lights. Linda, who was still holding the small mirror, noticed that it began to glow. It seemed to her that the mirror was showing her the way. She picked it up and saw that the reflection showed something else, a fire burning in the heart of the carousel. "Henry," she exclaimed, "the mirror is showing us what to do. The fire in the center of the carousel is its heart." Henry nodded, but they didn't know how to get to the center. Meanwhile, Emma, inside the carousel, had almost touched the base. Her fingers found something hot and pulsating. It looked like a heart that was beating, giving its power to the whole carnival. When Emma grabbed the heart, the carousel began to spin faster, and the lights began to flicker so brightly that it was blinding. Henry and Linda rushed to the carousel, and Linda lifted the mirror high into the air. The reflection in it began to pulsate with light, directing the rays to the base of the carousel. "Break it!" Henry shouted. Emma gathered all her strength and pushed. The heart cracked, and the carousel stopped. All the shadows moving around froze, and then began to disappear like smoke. The tent shook, and then disappeared along with all the rides. Emma, Henry, and Linda found themselves in an empty forest. Only a charred circle remained where the carnival had stood. Emma was sitting on the ground, staggering and trying to regain consciousness. Her face was pale, but there was a spark of life in her eyes. "Is it over?" Linda whispered. Henry looked at the charred tree in the middle of the circle and sighed. "For us, maybe, but this carnival will always find a new home if someone lets it in." They helped Emma up, and the three of them headed back to town. But as they walked, a soft whisper could be heard in the air for a long time. "The show must go on.